Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit the subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you find blog posts, podcasts, and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is historian Mark Wheatcroft of Mark's English History channel. Welcome, Mark.
Hello, Dan. Hello, everyone.
And today we're going to be discussing the Battle of Agincourt, which took place during the Hundred Years' War on October the 25th, 1415. And Mark, you did say how many years it was?
Yeah, 610.
610 years ago to this month. So the Battle of Agincourt takes place during a period, as I've already said, known as the Hundred Years' War. What were the causes of that conflict, Mark?
Well, the long-term causes actually trace their way back all the way to 1066 when William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, beats King Harold and takes the English crown, and that changes the European viewpoint as far as England is concerned. Because prior to that, England is part or parts of England were part of the Viking Empire, the Norwegian, Danish Empire. Eventually, the Vikings, those rulers are pushed out, with Edward the Confessor taking full charge of England, and then upon his death, Harold taking the crown. But once William takes the crown, he that viewpoint of and where the links to Europe are changed from being east across the North Sea to south across the Channel, and to places areas that we would today consider to be France. At that time, France was a much more fragmented land base. It wasn't just one kingdom. So, for example, you had the Duke of Normandy, you had the Dukedom of Brittany, for example, Flanders, so French and what today is French and Belgian Flanders, was one entity again under a dukedom. So the actual Kingdom of France was a lot smaller at the time than what we would consider it today. But this starts that process of in England looking south for its continental connections rather than east to Scandinavia. Fast forward then through the reign of the Norman kings until you get to the period of what's known as the anarchy, and that's the civil war that rages in England between King Stephen, who is one of is a grandson of William the Conqueror, but is a nephew of Henry the First, who died without an heir following his son's death in the White Ship disaster, and his daughter Matilda, who some claim was the rightful heir. And there's a civil war that takes place. Matilda is married to Geoffrey of Anjou, and the peace agreement that's eventually signed between Matilda and Stephen is that Stephen would continue his reign, but upon his death, it would be Matilda's son, Henry, who would take the crown. And Henry of Anjou is crowned king, and his wife he marries the former Queen of France, Eleanor of Aquitaine. And this starts what is known as the Angevin Empire. So this is where England controlled approximately one third of the French landmass, from Normandy all the way down to the Pyrenees. Now, over time, this gets chipped away through the reigns of their sons, Richard the First, and then King John, who loses a vast majority of this. Now, we then get into the period of the Hundred Years' War, and it starts in 1328, and there's a successional crisis. Charles the Fourth dies without a living heir. However, he does his wife is pregnant, so an agreement is made whereby someone, a cousin of his, Philip of Rouen, is named as regent, and depending upon the sex of the child at birth, will either act as regent until, if male, becomes king, will become aged enough to become king, or if female, then Philip would be crowned as king. Now, to do, to do that, they need to bring it. They bring in this a law which is called the Salic law, and that states that the it dates back to an old Frankish law, and it states that no female can be queen and ruler, but also that it prevents the descendants of a female line also claiming the throne. Now, why that's important is that at this time, the King of England, Edward III, is descendant of Isabella, Princess of France. So Henry II's wife. So if you know your films, this is the Queen in Braveheart. Now, because she's Queen, a princess of, and his daughter of the previous king, Philip the Fourth, this wouldn't this law writes out Edward from the line of succession. As things turn out, the baby daughter, the baby is a girl and is a daughter, so that enacts the Salic law. And in 1337, Edward himself denounces the Salic law and proclaims it, instates his right as King of France, because he feels that being a descendant of a princess of France and the descendant of a former French king, that he has a greater claim to the throne than Philip of Loire, and he proclaims himself King of France. And this is when you get the change in the coat of arms of England. So from the three leopards of the three Angevin leopards, which is most commonly referred to as three lions, and is obviously the coat of arms that we have on the England football shirt, for example, to the one that you see in the photo, in the picture there, where it's the quartered with the three leopards and the three fleurs-de-lis, to instigate that it is that claim of the dual thrones, that Edward himself is king of both the countries.
Thank you. Okay, so what's happened during the war up to the point of just before or when we get to Henry V's time?
So the war itself, although it's called the 100 Years' War, goes on for about approximately 120 years. But it's not day-to-day warfare like what we will see in the First World War, for example. It's going to be sporadic times of conflict followed by times of peace, whereby either that certain treaties have been signed and that's enabling the peace, or that there's just not much going on. So you do get the first battle itself takes place at sea, a battle called Salas, which is a naval battle. But what you're going to get, the first real set piece battle is going to take place on the 26th of August, 1346, at near a village called Cressy. And actually, it's only about 20 miles away from Agincourt. It's very, very close. And the actual what occurs and how it occurs is very similar. So in the build up to the battle, Edward the Third leads an army alongside his son Edward the Black Prince, the Prince of Wales, to Normandy, and they land on the Constantine Peninsula. And the place that they land is a place called Saint Vast at Let's Hoog, I think it's pronounced. And this is just south to the small French fishing village of Harfleur, which is important because that's the place from which it was the village of Harfleur that built William the Conqueror's flagship, the Moira, to bring him across to the to fight the Battle of Hastings. But it's also from here that the white ship set sail and struck a rock just on the outskirts of the town that would claim the life of Henry I's son. So it's a very important town for such a small town in that Norman period of English history. But also, if you fast forward to 20th century history, it's just to the north of Utah Beach from D-Day. So that's where he lands. They then march down through Normandy. So one of the reasons why they're going for Normandy is because ancestrally, the King of England believe they are. Although Edward is pursuing his claim to the French throne, he's also pursuing his claim to the Duchy of Normandy, which they've lost in the period of King John. And so they're going for what they believe is their ancestral lands first and foremost, and then the Kingdom of France afterwards. But they clash. The two armies clash on the 26th of August, 1346, outside the village of Crécy, overlooking an area known as the Val de Clercs. And the English army will position themselves on the ridge line there. Edward would take his command position at a windmill, and the army is divided into two divisions. On the left is Edward, Prince of Wales. After the battle, Crécy will be known as the Black Prince due to the black armour that he would wear that day. 16 years old. And on the right is the Earls of Northumberland and the Earl of Arundel's division. Archers would will position themselves to the front of the men at arms, and they would dig potholes in the ground in front of them to prevent or to disrupt cavalry charges. In terms of numbers, they're fairly similar, and in fact, the latest sort of research suggests that it's possible that the English were slightly outnumbered the French, but the French had more men at arms. So this is the height of the Hundred Years' War, is the height of the French knight, the French chivalry, and the English tended to fight for a bit more of a peasant army to bolster its numbers. So as the battle starts, just as the battle was about to start, there's a storm blows in, and it had been dry for about 6 weeks prior to this. So a storm makes the ground very wet, very slippery. So first of all, what happens is that the French send forward Genoese mercenaries, and these are crossbowmen. Now, crossbows, generally speaking, have got a greater range and are far more powerful than the English longbow. However, they do take longer to load. So normally what they would do, they're more of a defensive weapon from a fortification, ideal in those situations. Now, when you're out on the battlefield and you're in open country, crossbowmen normally would work in pairs. One will carry a form of shield that the crossbowmen could stand behind, protected whilst they conduct their loading process before firing. Now, these shields were left behind in the advance and due to the conditions, which meant that when the Genoese halted and began to fire, the advantage of the longbow came into it because they were able to fire a lot faster. Now, the other thing to bring up in terms of the storm is that with a longbow, you can detach your bowstrings, wrap them up, put them inside the helmets to keep them dry. On a crossbow, it's much harder to detach the bowstring. And so the bowstrings of the Genoese during this rainstorm got wet, which then reduced their range. So that brought the two weapons down to sort of a parable level, which meant that due to the range being brought fairly equal, the determinative factor will be the rate of fire that a longbowman can put out versus the crossbowman. And so what you get is the arrow storms from the English longbows will break the Genoese crossbowmen, and they begin to fall back. Now, the common history says at this point that the French knights, disgusted by the Genoese performance, ride forward and attack them. Now, whether or not this happens, or whether this is sort of something that comes up after the battle, is open to debate. But what certainly does happen is that the breaking of the Genoese and them falling back slows down the advance of the French knights as they charge uphill. And what you then get is, obviously they're going uphill, you've got the sun sort of just behind them, behind the English positions, and they can't see what's waiting for them at the top of the ridge. They're coming up through this firestorm. They hit the potholes, cavalry go down into them. Eventually, certain members of the cavalry and the dismounted men at arms do reach the English position, where there's intense fighting. So one of the Dukes of Alençon aims and goes after the Prince of Wales. He's defended by multiple dismounted men at arms, and eventually this assault is broken by a mixture of the arrow storms and the English dismounted men at arms. At this point, the English men at arms advance to push the French back down the hill. There's further charges that are made. So one is by John of Luxembourg. Now he's elderly, he's nearly blind. To enable the charge, he gets his horse tied to the bridles of other horses so that they can charge into battle. Another attack is made. It does meet greater success than the Alençon assault. However, again, broken and defeated by the engagement with the archers and the English men at arms. And John of Luxembourg is pulled from his horse and killed during this assault. During the assault, the Prince of Wales does fall, but is rescued by his standard bearer, Sir Richard Fitzsimmons. And throughout the rest of the afternoon, up to 13 other cavalry charges are mounted, are made against the English position. However, they do become more and more sporadic and disjointed. And as dusk fell, the English advanced, charged from their position. Most of the French fled. Philip VI, the king, a few of his men stood firm, and Philip himself had 2 horses killed from under him and was also struck on the jaw with an arrow. And both the royal banner and the sacred French oriflamme is captured, and eventually Philip VI is dragged from the field by his followers to prevent his capture. And so that's the first battle, the first big set piece battle of the 100 Years' War at Crécy. So then after that, you get another major battle occurs on the 19th of September 1356 at Poitiers. Now this is in southwest France, and this is led by Edward, Prince of Wales, who after winning his first battle at Crécy really becomes Edward's commander at this point, and takes the battles on to the French. And so what he's doing here is that part of the English territory that's within France is the area Gascony. This is down sort of Bordeaux to the Pyrenees, that kind of area. And so they're going to go and do a raid out into French countryside from that point. However, they are repulsed from crossing the Loire River, and then they establish a fortified position near to the town of Poitiers, where they're then attacked by the new French king, John II. But the first assault that's made is heavy armoured cavalry, crossbowmen and dismounted men at arms, and these are repulsed by the Anglo-Gascon forces, followed by a second attack of around 4,000 men at arms under John himself and his son Charles, who's the Dauphin. So the Dauphin is the French equivalent of the Prince of Wales. So it's the heir to the throne, the king's oldest son. And they're both repulsed. This is repulsed after a long day's fighting. The repulse of the Dauphin division leads to confusion, leading to Philip, the Duke of Orleans' third division, leaving the field. Now so the remaining force made 3 or 4 further assaults, but they're not able to take advantage of against the small force, and the French force collapses. And King John, Philip, his other son Philip, and approximately 2,000 to 3,000 men at arms are captured by the English forces. So they're two of the major battles that you get. And then in 1373, you get what's known as the Great Chevauchée. So Chevauchée is an armored raid. It's not an invasion per se. All it's doing is marching an armed force from one point to the other. So in this case, John of Gaunt, who is a younger son of Edward III, is aiming to lead this raid, and he's Duke of Lancaster. He's going to lead this raid from Calais to Bordeaux. So he leaves Calais in August 1373, and he arrives at Bordeaux in 1373. It's a 930-mile route that they take. It's the longest armed raid of the war, and they actually, to give you an idea of the route that they took, they go to the east of Paris and then down. So it's not even in a straight line. It's quite a circumvented route that they take. But what they're trying to do is, and the reason why these raids are taking place is one of the big things about kingship in the medieval period is your ability to maintain control. So if you've got this enemy army that's just rampaging its way across your country, wreaking havoc wherever it goes, your power as king is being diminished by these operations. So this is the sort of the almost the day-to-day, shall we say, of the 100 Years' War in terms of these raids that are going on, things like that. Not to this extent, but to just undermine the power of the French crown. Now, the Great Chevauchée is generally seen a bit of a failure because military and political results are nowhere near as catastrophic for the French as, say, Crécy or Poitiers, and the losses that are sustained by the English armies in this raid are quite high, considering the nature of the results that the Chevauchée come to. So you then get a breakdown. They start making Chevauchées, but they're of smaller nature at that point. And but then just to sort of half round it off is that you then get the death of Edward the Black Prince would die before Edward III. When Edward dies, he's succeeded by his young grandson Richard II, and due to political strife in England at the time, you then get this kind of closing off of or ending of that first period of the 100 Years' War, shall we say. So although the war between England and France technically is still going on, it does quieten down quite significantly during the reign of Richard II.
Okay, Mark, let's talk about Henry V. Could you please tell us about his early life and explain to us the rise of the Bolingbroks?
Yeah, so just so Bolingbroke is one of the subsidiary families of the royal family, just to make it a bit more understandable at this point. And they will rise to prominence during Henry's life. But Henry himself, he was born on the 16th of September 1386 at Monmouth Castle in Wales, and his early title was Henry of Monmouth. At his birth, he was never intended to be king. He was, like I say, a subsidiary family. He's a descendant of John of Gaunt, so a younger brother of Edward the Black Prince, and so a cousin or second cousin of the then King Richard II. So he's the son of Henry Bolingbroke, like I say, who is himself is the grandson. He's the son of John of Gaunt and the cousin of Richard II. So he begins military training at age 12 in 1399. And unusually, he's actually knighted twice during his life. So first of all, he's knighted by the then king, because only the kings can bestow a knighthood on someone. So he's knighted by Richard II whilst he's on campaign in Ireland. And at this point, we'll come on to this later, but he's actually under the king's service as a hostage to guarantee his father's good behaviour at this period of time. And then he's knighted again by his father the night before. Henry Bolingbroke is crowned as Henry IV. So how do we get to this stage? And this is where the rise of the Bolingbroks come in. So Henry Bolingbroke is the first cousin and was playmate to Richard II when they were both children in the royal household, and they were both admitted to the Order of the Garter together in 1377. So they're being paired up in the same way, that not as a double act, but they are being paired up to sort of be sort of significant rulers within England at the time. Obviously, Richard as king and Henry as his right hand man. But Henry's reign is very turbulent, and in 1387, during the Lord Appellant's rebellion, Henry sides with the Lord over his cousin, and that's when they sort of have an initial falling out. Now, once this rebellion is resolved, Richard doesn't punish Henry for his actions during this rebellion, and actually what he gets a elevation in position from the Earl of Derby to the Earl of Hereford. So it's clear that there's the family connections there are running strong. However, in 1398, there's another crisis that begins, and Henry is exiled out of England. Now, it's very sketchy as to where he's exiled to, but there is evidence to suggest that his father, John of Gaunt, was heavily influencing Richard in sending him into exile. However, in 1399, John of Gaunt dies. Now, this is when the two really fall out. Richard cancels the inheritance documents from John of Gaunt to Henry, and it's so that to get that inheritance, Henry has to beg and ask Richard for his inheritance. It's obviously not forthcoming. So Henry then starts to plot and make manoeuvres. So he returns to England whilst Richard is in Ireland, which is where Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V, is with him at the time. So this is the period that Henry of Monmouth is being held hostage by Richard. So it's not hostage as we would know it today. It's normally when someone's sent into exile, a family member is placed within the household of the king as a sort of ransom, so to speak, to give good behaviour. But Henry returns whilst Richard is in Ireland, sailing from Boulogne in France in the company of Thomas Arundel, who is the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who has been removed from position and sent into exile by Richard. So he's starting to make moves within the exile community, the anti-Richard factions. He comes back, he leads a military campaign, confiscating lands from people that were opposed to him, and he orders soldiers to destroy large parts of Cheshire. Now, initially, he was saying that he was only coming back and do it and launching this campaign to reclaim his inheritance. However, what you're going to find is he quickly starts gaining support through that anti-Richard faction, and as though that support and power grows, he finds himself in a position to declare himself king, because obviously he is likewise a descendant of Edward III. So he puts himself in a position, and it's to challenge Richard, and which he does. He declares himself king, and what he then does, his forces are able to capture Richard and Richard dies. Most commonly believed of he was starved to death, and also he bypasses Richard's name there, Edmund of Mortimer, and so the Bolingbroke take power. So some people would say that that's the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. However, obviously Henry himself is a descendant of a Plantagenet king, so it's kind of where you draw that line. But it certainly it what it will do is it will set precedent for what you will see with the various kings when we come to the Wars of the Roses at the back end of the 15th century. So then Henry Bolingbroke was crowned as Henry IV on October the 13th, 1399, and Henry of Monmouth is elevated to Prince of Wales. Now, the Prince of Wales title is disputed by Owen Glendower, who is the descendant of the Welsh royal family line that up until Edward III bestowed the title on Edward the Black Prince was always a Welsh title. So this is where you're going to get the young Henry, shall we say, start to rise to prominence in terms of being a military commander. So in that period, 1400 to 1408, he's a commander of parts of the English forces. He leads his troops into Wales on multiple campaigns against Owen Glendower. He was a contender for that Prince of Wales title. But this campaign in hostile country against an elusive enemy that knew the terrain, could move at will give the young Henry valuable experience in warfare. But also what you're also going to get in 1403 on the 21st of July is you're going to get the Battle of Shrewsbury. Now, this is a rebellion against Henry IV, and is known as the Hotspur Rebellion. So it's lords from Northumberland that are against Henry, what they believe is Henry IV's usurpation of power. And there's a large battle outside of Shrewsbury. Now, during this battle, Henry suffers a near fatal wound after being struck by an arrow in the left cheekbone. And if this would have happened to a ordinary or more common soldier, it would have been fatal. However, being the son of the king, he receives some of the best medical treatment available at the time. The king's physician, John Bradmore, conducts a complex operation to remove the bodkin point arrowhead from Henry's face, and that he survives the wounds. But what you will see is that this period of time, both the Battle of Shrewsbury and the campaign of Wales, Henry is very much coming up against the longbows. The longbow is famously, it's a Welsh weapon, and he himself is Welsh by place of birth, even if not by blood. This is all going to start to play in when we get to the Battle of Agincourt. Now, Henry IV, he dies on the 20th of March, 1413. And on the 9th of April, 1413, Henry V is crowned King of England. And he will then look to reinvigorate Edward III's claim to be King of France.
Yeah, so could you tell us about that then, Mark? So what is Henry's claim to France, the French throne, and what sort of negotiations will take place over that?
Well, it goes back again, it goes back to Edward III's claim as a descendant of Edward III. His claim goes back to his mother, Isabella of France. However, what sort of starts the process in reinvigorates it, not only have we now got another warrior king back on the throne, the situation in England is stabilised, so we can, again, the kings of England can start looking abroad rather than looking inwards. But also within France, you've got another political crisis starting to brew. So the now king, Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, was prone to various mental health issues. He thought he was made of glass. However, he does have a son, the heir, the Dauphin Louis, Duke of Guyenne. What you've obviously had as well during the period of Richard II's reign is the instability at home has meant that the focus has shifted back to home issues rather than the continent, and so the war came to a halt through that period, and they kind of remained peaceful during Henry's period as well. They're not, however, 1415 it all burst back into life. Henry renews his claim as a descendant of Isabella of France. Initially, he says that's his claim. It's obviously refused. The French have got a king, they've got an heir, and also they can point back to this Salic law that states that there's a prohibition of the lineage being passed by the female line. So it's right in Henry out. Now, Henry doesn't take this as an answer, so he makes the suggestion, the proposal, that he would marry the daughter of Charles VI, Catherine of Valois, and that they they would then act as sort of joint rulers, that could be named as queen, he would be the king of England, but obviously he, being the male, would have the power. Various embassies are exchanged throughout 1415. English delegates are in Paris. Early in that year, English delegates are in Paris. Even up until June 1415, there's French ambassadors in London. But all the time, Henry kind of knows this isn't going anywhere. So in the background, they're preparing for a war.
The English army is going to set sail for France, and it's going to leave from Southampton and landing close to the French town of Harfleur. Can you talk about the siege that takes place there, please?
Yeah, so the army set sails from, like I say, from Southampton, 11th of August 1415, and they're targeting Harfleur. Now, Harfleur, as well, you say, is a French town. Again, it's in Normandy, so this is one of the key aspects of it. And so at this point in time, we have got Calais as an English enclave, and the initial one of the initial plans is to grab Harfleur and create an English enclave in Normandy as well. It'll put English presence back into that the duchy that they rightfully see as theirs, and also they will it will enable a launch pad for future operations, as well as the operation that they are attempting to conduct. They land on, I believe it's the 13th of August. Unloading takes place. And on the 18th, the Duke of Clarence completes the investiture of the town, which means that it's now under siege. So you've got English forces covering the entire town. Now, siege operations in the medieval period and this period are commonly dictated by digging. So you would dig trenches to get closer to the walls, and then you would, in a lot of cases, mine. So you would dig underneath a section of the fortification, prop it up with wood, throw in other wood, haystacks, anything flammable, set fire to it. That will burn the supports and hopefully collapse the walls. Now, Harfleur, it is a coastal town, and it's in very marshy, boggy areas, and so this really frustrates the siege operations. Trenches are often flooded. Deep mines are particularly hard to run, and you get the French are quite good at counter mining these as well. So digging a mine underneath, doing the same thing, setting fire to it to drop the mine out, etc. And so you get to a point where we need to breach the walls. There needs to be an artillery bombardment. So artillery in this period is very, very basic. It is a black powder system, but what you're doing is you're throwing, rather than having sort of metal cannonballs that you would have through the early modern period, it's more like rocks that are being thrown, etc. So, and also things like trebuchets and basic siege work. So by the 3rd of September, the Harfleur still hasn't fallen. Although in a dispatch, Henry believes he hopes to have it captured within a week. However, there's a real problem starting to develop for the English army camped around there, and that is disease, most prominently dysentery. It's midsummer in Normandy. it can get quite hot. When I was over there in 2022, in the middle of the heat wave that year, it was stiflingly hot, and you're on marshy, boggy areas. You've got an army encamped, so you've got the filth of the siege lines. There's foul water, so you've got seawater. You've got that brackish sort of water where sea and fresh water meet. You've got sewage leaping in there. You've got all you haven't a possibility of a what you'd call a pure freshwater supply is probably non-existent. Add into that, you're going to get insect-borne diseases. There's going to be a reliance on shellfish diet as well. It's all causing a problem, and disease is rife through the English army and is really starting to take effect. Now, 15th of September, you do the French sally out and burn some of the English siege works. However, on the 16th of September, John Holland and his men managed to capture one of the main bastions of the town. So when you look at a fortification, a bastion is an advanced work. It's normally protecting a gatehouse or something like that. Once he takes that, he and that's in English hounds, it opens the key. It's the key to the city. On the 17th, the French come out under parley and agree that if either the king or dauphin have come to their assistance by the following Sunday, they would surrender. And on the 23rd of September, Harfleur surrenders itself to the English, and Henry and his army enter into the town. However, it has come at a cost. Over 2,000 are dead, including the Earl of Suffolk. Another 2,000, including the Duke of Clarence, have been returned home. And once this town is in English hands, it's going to need a garrison of around about 1,500 men. So quite a large chunk of Henry's army that is taken with him is now going to be incapacitated or out of use for Henry's plans. So the original plan was after capturing Harfleur was to march down to Gascony, the English held territory around Gascony, and lead one of those chevauchés like John of Gaunt did through that area of France. Now, with the loss of the numbers and the amount of time it took to capture Harfleur, that's impossible to do now. So Henry now needs to come up with some other ideas. So one of the things that he sends out an embassy for is to challenge the Dauphin to personal combat. They'll fight one-on-one. Winner will be named heir to the throne. Obviously, the Dauphin refuses that, doesn't want to fight Henry. And so Henry then has to come up with another solution as to what he's going to do with his army.
As you explained, Henry's army is in a poor state following the siege. What did he decide to do now?
So he's now deciding that obviously Harfleur is one of those enclave bastions of English territory in France. The original plan was to march to another one of Bordeaux and Gascony down in the south. That's too far now to do. So he's got one more option, and that's to march his army to the enclave at Calais, approximately 100-mile march from where he is at Harfleur to Calais. And so that's what they're going to do. And the reasoning is simple. It's the same as that the chevauchée, what we spoke about of John of Gaunt, is that military leadership, kingship is all about control. So if Charles and Louis, the Dauphin, were unable to prevent Henry's troops marching and marauding through their territory, then that power, that control element of kingship is defunct, and Henry can say, "Look, you're not in control. You're not king. Give the crown to me." And so on the 8th of October, Henry leaves the garrison at Harfleur and sets out with an army. It ranges, but you're looking approximately 6,000 to 8,000 men. Some have it a lot lower than that. unfortunately for this sort of time period, you just don't get full accounts of men. So various varying levels of argument as to how many actual members. Somewhere between 6 to 8,000 is probably a fairly good estimate as to the size of Henry's army. And they're carrying a week's rations for their 100 march to Calais, which under normal circumstances would probably be enough.
But to reach Calais, obviously, Henry's army has to cross a river that echoes through the annals of British military history. What happened at the River Somme?
Yeah, so the River Somme is, as you can see on the map there, for those of you watching on the YouTube video, is a large river that flows through that area of France. And back, if we go back in time to the Battle of Crécy, there was issues around crossing the Somme then, and you're going to get the same here. So on the 13th, Henry's army is approaching, and also if you go back even further, shall we say, the town at the very estuary, the St. Valery de Somme, that's where William the Conqueror would set out his on his invasion from. But obviously, we would know it from the 20th century, which we will touch upon later on during the episode here. But so around about the 13th of October. So we're nearly a week into the march. Henry is approaching the ford, and no, I'm not going to pronounce this right, at Blanchenquet. Um, and prior to getting to the ford, they capture a prisoner, and he advised that the Constable of France, that Albert was at the town of Abbeville with a force of 6,000 men, and the ford there was blocked with stakes and heavily guarded. And this is a major problem for Henry because obviously he needs to get up into the part of the Calais area and to the enclave of Paris. So he knows that the fords to the north of Abbeville are blocked. The ford at Abbeville is blocked. So all he can do is head south and hope that they can find a crossing. Obviously, that's in the opposite direction to where they want to be traveling. They're outnumbered, they're sick, and then they're running short of supply. In effect, at this moment in time, Henry and his army are trapped in enemy territory. If they can't find a crossing here, all they can do is hope for is to be able to return unmolested to Harfleur at this stage. However, they're going to head south to try and find their way across the river. As they march south, they encounter various other crossings. So Point St. Remy, the bridge is defeated. The bridge is defended. At the 14th, they can't find any crossings. By the 15th of October, they're opposite Amiens. However, they're not going to be able to force a crossing in front of a large fortified town. So they to continue to march south following the river, and eventually they reach the town called Beauvais. At this point, supplies are exhausted. So Henry parleys with the garrison at the chateau at Beauvais, and they agree that in return for Henry's armies not destroying the village and any surrounding areas, that the town would supply them bread, which they do. On the 17th, they're at Corby, where they skirmish with the garrison. Now, this is where Henry does two things. So, first of all, he orders all his archers to emburden themselves with further equipment, because he ordered them to cut 6-foot long stakes and sharpen them at both ends. So he's well aware now that the French army is very close and that combat is going to be highly likely. But also what he does here, and you can just see it on the map, but you've got quite a large loop in the river just to the east of Corby there. And what Henry does here is that he ordered his men to instead of tracing the river around that loop, that they're going to cut across it. Because obviously the French on the other side of the river do have to negotiate that loop. And so this is going to give Henry a time advantage by cutting off the distance that his men have got to march compared to the French. And then on the 18th, they received news that a suitable crossing has been found at Voyen. The 19th, the advance guard of Henry's army moves into the marshes, and they, under Sir Gilbert and Freville and Sir John Cornwall, they secure the bridgehead on the other side of the river. And by midday, the main force is beginning to cross. They are attacked at this stage by French advanced pickets, possibly from Peronne. However, it's not substantial or concerted, and by 5 p.m. the crossing is complete, and they're encamped at Aphius that night. And by the 20th, they moved past Peronne, and that night. Now I said about Henry being Welsh and a large portion of his archers being Welsh. There is actually a link here, because that night they camp in the area on what will become the 20th century First World War Somme battleground, near to the village of Mamet and Fricourt. Now, in 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, the Mamet Woods is where the 38th Welsh Division are heavily involved and suffer horrendous casualties. So there is a quite a big link there. On the 22nd, they've moved up to a town called Ancre. Today it's known as Albert, which is just behind the main part of the Somme battlefield, and the Ancre River today still is one of the key areas of that battle. By the 23rd, they're up towards Toulon, and then they're moving inland. And on the 24th, that they will be camped out in front of a village called Maisoncel. And then in the distance, a short distance away, it will be a chateau named Agincourt, and that is where the French are waiting for them.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Okay, so this leads us to the point where obviously the English and French army are going to meet. Can you describe some of the differences between the two armies? Now, I've got a mixture here. Majority of it is English. Believe the French had cavalry, and I don't think the English did. Is that right? But just tell us a little bit of difference between the two armies and what they're armed with.
Yeah, so the easiest way, I wouldn't say the easiest way, but this is the height of the medieval period, the chivalric period, and so that's very still evident in the French army. In the English army, there's still a very high social structure. However, the majority of it, you would almost say, is a peasant army at this stage, in terms of being archers. They're men that are called to the banner when needed. You're looking at the English army, approximately 6,000 to 8,000 men. Roughly 1/6 of that is the men at arms. So that's what you would say you'd call the knights. It's not necessarily, because you don't have to be knighted to be a man at arms, but you're going to be heavily armored. They're going to fight on foot. As the pictures show there, they're armed with swords, they're armed with pole axes. These are trained soldiers to do that specific job. And then about 5-6 of them are archers. Now, the archers have been trained since childhood to pull the longbow. This is in that period where football is banned as a sport, so that people could concentrate on archery as a skill. And actually, if you although not many skeletons have been found from the Agincourt battlefield, where skeletons have been found on battlefields of archers, and most prominently the skeletons that have come up from the Mary Rose shipwreck. You can really see the deformity in the body that pulling these longbows would cause, because there is almost like a hunchback, because the amount of strain that's placed on the body, the muscle strength that's required, etc. And so you've got these archers now. The British are their command structure. You've got Henry, obviously Henry V, Henry the Duke of York, his uncle, Thomas Cromwell, and Thomas Erpingham, who's going to be the commander of the archers. Because the men at arms, they are dismounted. They're not mounted like the French. They are still wearing full armor, and they're armed, like I say, swords, pole axes, war hammers, things like that. They are heavily armored, and then the archers, as well as having the longbow, they've got their 6-foot stakes which they're going to plant in front of them, but also they're lightly armed and lightly armored as well. So they're wearing sort of, like, for example, leather jerkins, things like that. But they're also armed. They've got knives, daggers, hammers. Anything that can put someone to their death. Basically, they've got as well. It's not just the arrows that are going to come into play here. A French, there's approximately 14 to 15,000. 4 or 5,000 archers. Well, when we say archers, they're armed with the crossbow rather than the longbow, as we've already discussed. The advantages and disadvantages of the crossbow in open field versus the longbow. And then you've got approximately 10,000 men at arms. These will be a mixture of mounted and dismounted men at arms. And they're going to be commanded by Charles d'Albret, who is the Constable of France, the Duke of Orleans, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bourbon. Now, one of the problems that the French have, because neither the King or the Dauphin are there, there's a real breakdown in command structure where different dukes feel like they're in command of different things, and there's no real. Whereas Henry is sole commander. He's got his divisional commanders, but he's the central commander. You've got a much more fragmented command structure in the French army, and this is going to cause all kinds of confusion when it comes to the battle.
Thank you, Mark. The armies would clash near to a small chateau called Agincourt. Can you explain the topography of the battlefield, please?
Yeah, so it's going to be on this field just to the north of the Chateau of Agincourt, and like I said earlier, the English army is encamped in front of the village called Mazancel. So it's approximately about a mile, easy mile walk down a nice little country lane today from the Agincourt village to Mazancel. So not a particularly long battlefield. And the French are encamped near to Agincourt, between the villages of Agincourt and Tramacourt. Now, on either side of these villages is some woodland, as the battlefield as you move from Agincourt up towards Mazancel. And as you move up there, the woods gradually sort of narrow, and then they open up again at Mazancel. So where the English army are encamped, and obviously the battle is going to be in October. It's been ploughed recently, as part of the harvest, and it would rain the night before. So this is going to be a real sticky, muddy mess of a battlefield when it comes to being fought over the following day on the 25th.
Okay, Mark, do you want to talk us through the Battle of Agincourt as it starts and how it proceeds?
Yep. So Henry will form his army up. So you're going to have one big block division of men at arms in the centre, and then 2 divisions either side of archers. Now, it's the beginning of the day. So he's formed his men up, and he addresses his men. It's not the Shakespeare St. Crispin's Day speech, but he will address his men. And then he gives orders to advance. So what he's going to do, he's going to move his army into that narrowest part of the woodland. So upon that order, the army dropped to their knees. Obviously, it's pre-Reformation, so it's a Catholic English army. They kiss the ground. They say there's a call, cry God for Harry, England and St. George, and they move forward. So they advance into that narrowest point. So, and then the archers hammer in their stakes. Now, there's a number of reasons why moving into that narrowest area will come to him. Is one of the masterstrokes that Henry pulls off during this battle. So first of all, it reduces the frontage. The French can't really bring their significant number advantage to bear when you're fighting in such a small area. What the French ideally want is a wide enough area that they can put as many men in their front ranks as possible and really stretch out the English one. By Henry positioning himself in this in this very narrow position, it prevents that. It also prevents the French from being able to really outflank them because they can't get round into these woodlands, can't get round behind them. So you will come to an incident that happens in the rear later, but at this moment in time, that woodland is hemming in the French and is acting as an advantage to Henry, and it basically just means that they are unable to deploy enough forces to really bring those numbers to bear. So what you're going to end up getting is you're going to get those numbers stacking up behind rather than being able to spread out and thus stretch the English army further and further apart, where they can then break through, or the English army keeps itself concentrated, but then the French can encircle them. This has been cut off, so it's a real masterstroke from Henry. Also, what it does as well is it moves the English army straight up forward, thus bringing the static French army all into range of the longbows almost straight away throughout the battle.
Can you talk us through the French's first charge, please?
Yeah, so again, I've spoken about the English disposition, so let's just talk about the French briefly. So what you've got in their front rank is you've got one division of dismounted men at arms, two divisions of cavalry on the flanks, and then behind that front rank of division of men at arms, you've got another division of men at arms behind that, and then a cavalry block behind that. I wouldn't say it's divisions because it looks on a lot of the maps that you see that rather than one big block of cavalry, it's sort of various squadrons of cavalry. So I'll call it a block for sake of argument. Now, the English have moved up and they will start to fire their longbows. The French will in turn move their crossbowmen up and to counteract that fire. Much like what we saw at Cressy, obviously we said it rained the night before. We know the limitations of the crossbow in terms of they're not able to disengage the bowstring in the same way the longbow is, so the range is affected. Thus, you've got, and add on to that, you've got the rate of fire that the longbow can bring onto the crossbow. And so very quickly, almost after sort of one volley, the crossbowmen are out of there, and we're then going to look at the various aspects of the French assault. Now, what you get to begin with, and this comes down to what we were saying, I was saying earlier about this fragmentation of command, is that the two cavalry blocks, divisions on either side of that mounted men at arms block, make their initial charge. Now, the problem that they're going to charge down the field, they're going to come straight into the arrow storms of the English archers. Now, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of conjecture around how deadly these arrow storms were to mounted men at arms. And it's suggested that sort of unless you're almost at close range, that actually the arrows won't pierce plate armor. You'll probably get areas maybe where you've got a bit of mail at joints that that can penetrate. But the main killing feature of the arrow storm is going to be on the horses, because horses, as although they're armored, they've got certain areas of armor, but there's a lot of bare muscle on a horse that you can strike, and so you're going to bring down a lot of the charges. The ones that were brought down are brought down by hits to the horses rather than to the men. And but once those horses start falling, there's obstacles in the way. So you've got a horse lying there, another horse is going to hit it, come down, and when these men are being obviously the knights are being thrown from the horses in heavy armor into a wet, soggy, puddled battlefield that they're struggling to get up. You've got more and more more and more horses and men coming over the top. And also what you've got again to bear in mind, you've got that funneling effect of the woodland. So instead of it just being a straight charge, what started off as a wide charge is gradually getting smaller. So the two divisions are getting pushed together. Eventually, some of them do get down to the stake barricades, but they're not able to really penetrate it. The horses rear up. So the reason why they were sharpened to a point at both ends is, if you remember when we did the Battle of Waterloo episode, we talked about when you form the square and you've got the bayonets on point now. Horses don't charge sharp points. French knights thrown at the barricades, and when they're thrown, they're dispatched by the archers that are there with the rudimentary weapons that they have. And so the cavalry's been repulsed. Now, where can they go? We've already discussed you've got this thick woodland on either side of the battle, on the either side of the field. So the only way they've got to go is back up the battlefield. Now, the problem that the French are then going to have is that first division, that front division of mounted men at arms, who are also part of the French chivalric tradition, have fought their way to push their way to be at the front of this battlefield, of advancing down the field. And so what you get is the routed, retreating French cavalry slam into the front of their own men as they advance. And this happens, they're still within range of the arrow storm. It takes quite a time for this to disengage and to sort itself out. And by that point, the real impetus of that assault has been broken by the cavalry just slamming into it. They will advance up, they will get up to the English lines, but all the strength of it's been taken out by this point.
Okay, so the French obviously try quite a few charges, don't they? So how many in total?
They do. So that you then get a second infantry charge. Um, the arrow storm against the infantry charge isn't as severe as what you'll get against the cavalry, because, as we discussed, the armor of men is a lot more substantial than the horse armor. There's a lot less bare flesh to aim at and to hit and to cause issues with. However, what it's going to do is it's going to mean that all the armor is going to have to be on. So the visors are down. They're going forward as trying to keep themselves protected as possible against across this wet southern field. So if ever you've walked across a freshly farmed field and the mud all sticks to your boots, how heavy that quickly becomes. Well, think of doing that in plate armor. And so they're going to be tired before they even reach that English line. They do reach the English line, and it's pushed back, and it does start to bow. However, what that bowing does is that it then brings the archers that were originally positioned on the flanks, then they're properly firing into the flanks, almost at point blank range, so that this is where the strength of the longbow can pierce various elements of armor. So I'm not going. It's probably not going to go for a breastplate or something like that. But if you can get into a joint or something like that, you can get through. Again, once these soldiers are knocked to the ground, whether that's by archers, whether that's by the English men at arms, the ground conditions means that it's very hard for the French soldiers to get up. In fact, the late historian Richard Holmes described it very much like almost like probably something similar to what happened at Hillsborough in terms of a crushing effect. You've got you got people on the floor, and then more and more people going over the top. Um, and what you've also got within that is that you've got the archers that either they're out of arrows or they're just seeing their opportunity. They're light, they're nimble, they've got daggers, hammers, clubs, and where there's these soldiers on the floor, they're just going around and they're just dispatching them there and then, um, making easy work of it. And so this approximately the battle lasts for approximately 3 hours. The Henry's massively involved in hand-to-hand fighting. At one point, his brother Humphrey's wounded and he's on the floor, and Henry's actually standing over the top of him, protecting him until he's able to get dragged away. And you've by the time of the end of the battle, you're gonna the Duke of York is the most senior British person who's killed. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, is dead. The Duke of Alençon is dead, and with him, the French sacred banner, the Oriflamme, is lost within the field, and it's not recovered. And then, sort of by that point, any sort of third attack is kind of going to wither out because it's just that they've seen what's happened, and it's there's not going to be another third attack really at this point.
Battle ends in controversial circumstances. What happened?
Okay, yeah. No, so what you're gonna there is one last. I wouldn't say attack. It's a sortie from the garrison of the Chateau of Agincourt, and they are able to find a way because they're they're the local troops. They're able to find a way through the forest of Agincourt and round the back of the English forces, and attack the camp. Now, when the attack happens on the camp, it's feared that there, there's prisoners back there. They might rise up and fight and attack they can be released, they can rise, they can be armed, and they can attack the English from the rear. So Henry issues a controversial order, and that is to execute all the prisoners. Now, reason why it's controversial is obviously by modern standards, we think a Geneva Convention and that prisoners are to be treated respectfully, etc. You didn't have the Geneva Convention in this period, but you had what we called the Code of Chivalry, and that is that men of high status would be kept as prisoners and be ransomed back to families. So, for people of high status, this is a significant loss of potential earnings that they could gain by executing people of rank. Where if the English archers have been captured, they knew what was coming. That they will be executed. There won't be any quarter left to them. In fact, the old two-finger salute, it is said to have come from this period where because one of the common punishments dealt to English archers by the French would be to cut off those two fingers because they were the bow fingers. A lot of argument as to whether or not that's true or not, but that's supposedly where that gesture comes from. But in terms of higher class, high status people, so if you obviously get a king or prince, duke, something like that, then they would be expected to be kept alive, kept in comfort until the family pay the necessary money to have them released. And so, especially for the knights of the realm of England that will be benefiting from that money, this was a very controversial order, and in fact, most of the executions are believed to be carried out by the archers because they weren't going to be profiting from it.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Okay, so the Battle of Agincourt was a comprehensive victory for the English army and has rightly gone down as one of Britain's greatest military victories. But what impact did the battle have at the time?
Yeah, so before we come on to the actual impact of the battle at the time, if we just go quickly through the like what happens following it. So Obviously, we've already discussed the state of Henry's army prior to the battle. It's in an even worse state following it. Yes, it wins this magnificent victory against the odds. However, it's been pretty chewed up in the process of doing so. So they're not in a position to follow up. They can't march on Paris or anything like that. So Henry could continues the march to Calais. It's from that point, it's not that far away. So to get there, and they arrive on the 28th. So you have the battle fought on the 25th. They probably leave on the 26th, or 2 days later. They're within Calais, and then 2 weeks after that, they're in Calais for around about 2 weeks whilst everything gets sorted out. Sort of people are cared for, transports are organised and brought over, etc. And on the 16th of November, the mate a large proportion of the army that's returning, so some probably will stay in Calais, land at Dover. And then there's a victory pageant in London to celebrate the great victory over the French. Henry himself would return to France um, in the 1420s. And in 1421, the Treaty of Troyes is signed between England and France. And that treaty, one, secures the engagement between Catherine of Rouen and Henry himself, but also it states that that whoever um, that Henry would be declared heir to the French throne. Now, unfortunately, Henry would die prior to um, before Charles um, would in and so it's his son Henry the young Henry VI who would be crowned as king of both kingdoms. However, he would only briefly hold on to the French crown and would ultimately lose the English crown during the War of the Roses.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Okay, so let's talk about actually visiting the battlefield because that's something you've done yourself, haven't you? So,
Yeah.
how accessible is it, and what was it like?
So I've actually visited it twice now. First time I visited was early 2000s, and there was very little there. There was a small sort of exhibition in the village hall. But recently, so the pictures that you see on the screen are from when I visited in 2023. There's a new museum open there. It's a fantastic museum. Um, well worth the trip. And it's only about an hour's drive, hour and 10 minutes drive from Albert. So a lot of like when I visited it, I was over during the First World War visits and took a day trip at back of the lines to go and visit. But it's well worth it. Very good museum. Um, you in the museum, you can pick up a little leaflet, and it's got a walk around some of the roads that basically circumvent the battlefield. There's a little observation point up at the crossroads of Mass and so you get a look down, and you can see some undulations there, and it's in a way it's a little bit hard to work out because the both the forests are gone. Um, there's actually a V1 or V2 site close by as well. So the forests are gone, but if you look at the battlefield, there is sort of a defined sort of ridge line. So I actually, if you go on my channel, I've actually done one of my GoPro videos walking around the battlefield, and it's sort of this defined ridge line right across the centre. It's like, could that be the spot where the English made the stand? But obviously, we know it's at the narrowest point of the tree line, so it will be a little bit hard to say, but it's well worth the visit. And also from there, it's only about a 20-minute, half an hour drive to the Cressy battlefield as well. And again, they've got a little museum there. You can there used to be a structure, or there is a structure um, where the windmill was that will give you an overview of the battlefield. But when I went there, it was closed. It didn't look in great repair. But there is a little visitor centre there, and you walk down the battlefield to get to it. So it's quite interesting to worth. Again, if you're out in that direction, you might as well pick up both because it's not a there's not a lot of either. But if you do both do them both in the same day, then you've got a full day's visit there. One thing that did make me laugh though is that when you come out of the battle out of the museum at Agincourt, they've got the signs up, please drive on the right. So they obviously don't get too many French visitors there compared to English.
Excellent. Thanks, mate. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about Henry V's legacy as far as, a lot of it was, the history, again, like you said, back then wasn't recorded as it is nowadays, or, some of it's hard to put together, isn't it? But
Yeah.
William Shakespeare obviously created a play of Henry V. So just tell us a little bit about, that and how his legacy has been shaped by Shakespeare.
Yeah, so obviously, I'm not sure if I said it on the video, but there's only four sources that eyewitness sources of the battlefield that were written at the time. So, like with a lot of medieval battlefield battles, it's very hard to put together the story and the numbers, etc. And so, one of the reasons why probably Agincourt and Henry V resonates so much still is Henry V. So, it's one of those one of his Lancastrian play, his historical Lancastrian plays. So we have to bear in mind that William Shakespeare is a playwright in the Tudor period, and the Tudor kings, kings and queens come from at the time what would have been described as a minor line of the House of Lancaster. Obviously, they propelled themselves due to circumstances up into being through Henry VII being the King of England. And so he writes a lot of plays around the Bolingbroke Henry IV's seizure of power through to Henry VII's seizing of power, that Lancastrian War of the Roses era. And Henry V is one of the prominent ones that we will see come to the fore probably more often than some of the others. And certainly in terms of films, so there have been two film adaptations of them. So the first one came out in the 1944, I think it's 44, the Laurence Olivier one, um, done by a more of a theatre actor, produced during the height of the Second World War. So it's very much a propaganda piece in terms of the English overcoming that superior force, exactly what they're sort of going through at the time. And then obviously you then get the 1989 Kenneth Branagh one, which is a little bit more historically accurate in terms of sort of when we look at, say, the battlefields, the conditions, etc. You look at Laurence Olivier one and you've got this mass cavalry charge that goes on for about 15 minutes and they go across about two paddles. Whereas the Laurence Olivier one, Kenneth Branagh film is a lot more infantry involved. There you could see them going down in mud, things like that. So it is more historically accurate. However, we have to remember they are both Shakespeare plays that are being portrayed on screen, so they're not an attempt to be a real true to life story. And just going back quickly to the to sort of that propaganda narrative, there's actually a story that comes out in 1914 when the British Army are on the retreat from Mons and they're moving through. They don't they don't get pushed back as far as the Agincourt battle, but they're certainly moving through that area from Agincourt to Calais, and they're being pushed back by the Germans. And there's a story in one of the newspapers of how these ghostly archers have risen out the ground and started firing arrows towards the Germans to help protect the English rear guard.
Hmm.
So
Very interesting.
Agincourt is one of those things alongside the likes of the Armada and Rorke's Drift that sort of every now and again, whenever sort of is brought back to the national conscience.
It's quite legendary, I suppose, isn't it? Especially when
Yeah,
it comes to the archers and the longbowmen.
yeah, and the fact that they were so heavily outnumbered and sort of riddled with disease and sort of like everything said that they were going to get defeated, and yet they pull off one of the most stunning victories.
Now, a couple of years ago, Netflix released The King, which I've seen myself. But again, not being super knowledgeable about the period when I watched it, or the Battle of Agincourt, but it is obviously depicted in that. Battle scenes are fantastic. Again, I don't know how accurate it is as a movie, but you haven't actually seen this, have you, Mark?
No, I've only had Netflix for a little while, so I haven't. There's a lot of things that I'm still getting around to, and a lot of things that I'm catching
Yeah.
up on, various things. So, right now I'm in the middle of. It's not actually on Netflix. It's on YouTube. That I found it. It's series called Anzacs. Looking at the First World War, Australians in the First World War, because I was at Gallipoli last month.
Hmm.
But it's filmed back in the 1980s, and Paul Hogan's in it from Crocodile Dundee fame, and a few others who, if you sort of remember the first series of Neighbours, they're sort of kicking around in it. So I'm watching that at the moment. But
Okay, cool. Yeah,
it
no,
go
I
on.
mean, it's definitely something for you to go and watch, and then you can report back to me whether it was historically accurate or not.
And I've just finished watching King and Conqueror, but the less I say about that, the better, I think.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to bother. But anyway, Mark, all that is left to say is thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us about the Battle of Agincourt. And all that is left to say is cheers.